So you want to own a nuclear power plant? Guaranteed baseload power, contracts with the biggest technology companies on Earth, a machine that runs at nearly full output 90% of the time, for 60 to 80 years straight, which sounds like the safest bet in the entire energy industry. So why did one of these projects become the single most expensive power plant ever built in human history, while a different one got abandoned completely after $9 billion with the executives going to prison? Buy the reactor, sign the power contract, collect for 80 years, except that's almost never how it goes. Because owning a nuclear plant isn't really a bet on physics. The physics has worked safely for 70 years. It's a bet on financing, regulation, and your own ability to survive a decade of spending before you ever earn a single dollar. So, you still want one? Let's find out what you're actually buying. Here's the part that actually justifies the hype. A nuclear reactor doesn't burn anything. It splits uranium atoms in a tightly controlled chain reaction, and that single process is almost absurdly energy dense. 1 kilogram of uranium fuel, fully used, can produce roughly the same electricity as burning 3 million kilograms of coal. That's the entire pitch, in one number. And once a reactor is actually running, it delivers on that promise. American nuclear plants operate at a capacity factor above 90%, meaning they produce near their maximum output almost every hour of the year. Solar manages 20 to 30%, wind 30 to 45%, nothing else in the electricity business. Is this reliable? This consistently. So the physics is proven. The reliability is real. Inside the reactor, the whole process is controlled by rods made of materials like boron or cadmium, which absorb the neutrons flying out of that chain reaction, slide them in deeper. The reaction slows down. Pull them out. It speeds up in an emergency. Every rod drops in at once, a maneuver called a scram, and the chain reaction stops within seconds. About 2/3 of the world's operating reactors are a design called a pressurized water reactor, where the water touching the radioactive fuel is kept under such extreme pressure it never actually boils, and its heat gets transferred to a completely separate loop of water. That becomes the steam that spins the turbine. The radioactive water and the steam that touches the machinery never mix. It's the same basic principle a coal plant uses to make electricity, with one part swapped out entirely, which makes what comes next so strange. Here's what it actually costs to build one in America, right now. Plant Vogtle in Georgia is the only new nuclear plant completed in the United States this century. In 2012, it was budgeted at $14 billion, targeting completion by 2017. The final cost, when the last reactor finally came online in 2024, 7 years late, $36.8 billion, the most expensive power plant ever constructed on Earth. Somewhere between $10,000 and $16,000 for every kilowatt of capacity, compared to under $1,500 for wind, solar, or natural gas. Financing costs alone roughly doubled during construction, from $4 billion to $7 billion, for one simple reason. Interest doesn't pause just because the building isn't finished yet. Every extra year on the calendar is a year of debt quietly compounding on a project earning zero revenue. Part of why delays cascade so badly is that almost nothing about this building is standard. The reactor vessel itself, a forged steel pressure container weighing hundreds of tons, is manufactured by only a small handful of specialized foundries anywhere on the planet. And a single casting defect can push an entire multi-year schedule back by months. The containment structure around it, that famous concrete dome, is built with walls several feet thick, reinforced to survive earthquakes and aircraft impact, and every weld, every batch of concrete, every bolt is individually documented and inspected before it's allowed to matter. Here's the part almost nobody outside the industry understands. You'd expect a project that ran $22 billion over its original budget to be a financial disaster for the company that built it. For the plant's owner, Georgia Power, it wasn't. Under the regulatory model these utilities operate under, the company earns a guaranteed rate of return on however much capital it has invested in the plant. One independent analysis found Georgia Power pocketed roughly $17 billion in profit in the very same years it was racking up $18 billion in cost overruns on this project. The bigger the overrun, the bigger the investment base. The bigger the investment base, the bigger the guaranteed return. The customers paying the monthly electric bill absorbed the risk. The company collecting that bill profited from the delay. Multiple state regulators who approved the project went on to lose their next election once the bills arrived. So, you still want to own a nuclear power plant. Here's what happens when the same bet goes all the way wrong instead. Voggtle's contractor was a company called Westinghouse, one of only 2 firms that has built nearly every reactor in the Western world. Westinghouse was also the contractor on a second American project happening at the exact same time in South Carolina. And that one didn't just go over budget, it went to prison. VC Summer in Jenkinsville, South Carolina, 2 new reactors owned by the utility SCANA and the state-owned Santee Cooper, built by that same Westinghouse. By 2017, the project was catastrophically behind schedule. Rather than tell regulators the truth, senior executives lied repeatedly about construction progress they knew was false. specifically to keep ratepayer charges flowing in, while they searched for a way out. On July 31st, 2017, the owners abandoned the project entirely. $9 billion spent, 0 watts of electricity ever generated. The fallout was criminal, not just financial. Scana's CEO was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and a $5 million penalty. The company's chief operating officer received 15 months. 2 Westinghouse executives were separately convicted, one for perjury, one for falsifying records. Westinghouse itself, bleeding money on both Vodal and VC Summer, at the same time filed for bankruptcy in 2017. In the middle of construction on both projects simultaneously, South Carolina customers are still paying off more than $2 billion today for reactors that will never generate a single kilowatt hour. And this isn't a uniquely American problem. Finland's Olkiluoto 3 reactor was supposed to take about 4 years starting construction in 2005. It took 18. France's Flamanville project suffered its own decade of delays and multiplying costs. Western nuclear construction across 3 separate countries, 3 separate contractors, 3 separate governments keeps producing the same result. Whatever the original budget says, expect the real number to be wrong by billions. Not every country runs into this the same way. France gets roughly 70% of its electricity from a nuclear fleet built decades ago, largely with standardized designs and centralized state financing, and now leans on that history for some of the most stable power prices in Europe. China is currently building reactors faster than anywhere else on Earth using the same standardized approach, state-backed financing, and a domestic supply chain that doesn't have to relearn the process on every single project. Western countries, by contrast, tend to build one custom project at a time, which means every single one relearns the same expensive lessons from scratch. So, you still want to own a nuclear power plant. Let's say you survive construction. Here's how the money actually works once you're running. Electricity sales are only the first layer. Grid operators also pay reactors simply for being available, whether they're dispatched or not, because the grid needs guaranteed backup capacity sitting in reserve at all times. That's called a capacity payment, and for a reliable plant, it can be substantial money earned before a single extra electron is sold. On top of that, ancillary services. Frequency control, voltage support, grid stability. Large generators get paid for these too, because batteries and intermittent sources can't fully replace what a massive spinning turbine does for grid physics. And increasingly, revenue comes from long-term power purchase agreements, signed directly with a single corporate buyer, locking in a price for 10, 15, 20 years at a time. That structure is exactly what let Vodal's lenders sleep at night, despite the construction chaos. Predictable buyers for decades, regardless of what wholesale electricity prices did in any given month. Without a contract like that locked in ahead of time, banks generally won't finance a project this large at all because nobody can reliably predict what a megawatt hour will sell for 20 years from now. And a plant this expensive only makes sense as a multi-decade bet. Ownership itself varies more than most people assume, too. Some reactors are run by large investor-owned utilities, some by state or municipal power authorities, some through joint ventures, splitting the risk across several companies at once, precisely because very few single organizations want to hold this much exposure alone. Here's a genuine surprise about the cost side. Most people assume uranium fuel is the plant's biggest expense. It isn't. Fuel typically represents a modest share of total operating costs, sometimes less than a fifth. The real ongoing costs are labor, security, and compliance. A large reactor employs several hundred people permanently, sometimes close to 1,000 across multiple units, and that number briefly multiplies into the thousands, every 18 to 24 months when the plant shuts down for a refueling outage. During that outage, only about a third of the fuel actually gets replaced. Workers inspect and rebuild pumps, turbines, and steam generators, and the entire operation is planned years in advance, down to the day. Because every outage that runs even slightly long costs millions of dollars in lost electricity sales, with none of the fixed costs, like salaries and security, pausing to match. Security costs run far beyond a normal power plant, too. Armed response teams, biometric access, cybersecurity monitoring, and continuous federal inspection, all as fixed costs, whether the reactor is having a record year or a terrible one. There's one more cost category, unlike almost anything else in the power business. Insurance. Private insurers on their own generally can't cover the largest conceivable nuclear accident scenario. So in the US, a specific federal framework called the Price-Anderson Act combines private insurance with an industry-wide pooled fund that every operator contributes to, backstopped ultimately by the federal government. No other form of electricity generation in America has an equivalent law built just for it. So, you still want to own a nuclear power plant. Here's a risk that has nothing to do with financing and everything to do with public trust. Only 3 civilian nuclear accidents have ever meaningfully changed the global industry. 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in 1986, and Fukushima in 2011. 3 completely different failures in 3 completely different countries under 3 completely different regulatory systems. every one of them rewrote safety rules worldwide. And every one of them is the reason a modern plant carries the layers of redundant cooling, backup power, and independent inspection that it does today. And yet, when researchers actually count deaths per unit of electricity produced over the long run, nuclear consistently ranks among the very safest sources of power on Earth, generally alongside wind and solar, while coal and oil rank far higher due to air pollution alone. The fear is proportional to how dramatic and visible the risk feels. The statistics tell a different story than the fear does. Here's what happens decades from now at the other end of the timeline. Eventually, every reactor has to be decommissioned, dismantled, decontaminated, the site restored to something else. That alone typically costs $300 to $600 million, and every U.S. operator is legally required to save toward it, starting a dedicated trust fund from the very first day the plant opens. American trust funds collectively hold close to $100 billion right now, sitting there for exactly this future purpose. Here's the part that would have sounded insane 5 years ago. In 2026, for the first time in the industry's history, plants already in the decommissioning process are being pulled back out and restarted. In September of 2024, Microsoft signed a 20-year agreement to buy the entire output of a reactor that had been shut down since 2019 for economic reasons. The reactor is 3 Mile Island Unit 1, Pennsylvania, not the reactor that partially melted down in 1979, in the worst nuclear accident in American history, the one standing directly next to it. Constellation Energy is spending $1.6 billion to bring it back online. Renamed the Crane Clean Energy Center, backed by a $1 billion federal loan, all 835 megawatts of its output, enough to power roughly 800,000 homes, are contracted to Microsoft alone for the next 20 years. Microsoft isn't the only one. Meta signed a 20-year deal for the entire output of a nuclear plant in Illinois. Amazon signed a 17-year deal for nearly 2 gigawatts from a plant in Pennsylvania. 3 of the richest technology companies on Earth are now functionally in the business of reviving reactors. The market had already written off because there was no other way to guarantee the round-the-clock power their data centers need. So, you still want to own a nuclear power plant. Here's where the story turns speculative. The industry's proposed answer to Vodal-style disasters is the small modular reactor factory built, smaller, supposedly cheaper and faster to construct as of right now. 0 of them are commercially operating anywhere in the Western world. And yet SMR stocks have exploded regardless. One company, NewScale, is up more than 400% since the start of 2024. Another, Oklo, is up nearly 600%, and at points last year, both were up over 1,000%. Neither company has a single operating reactor. Neither has earned $1 of actual reactor revenue. NewScale's own flagship customer project, the only SMR design that ever received full U.S. regulatory approval, was canceled in 2023. After the electricity price its customers would have had to pay jumped from $58 a megawatt hour to $89. The company's first real reactor revenue isn't expected until sometime in the early 2030s. Oklo, its main rival, is targeting the end of 2027 for its first small reactor and has been signing preliminary deals directly with data center operators rather than traditional utilities, betting that hyperscalers desperate for power will tolerate the first-of-its-kind price premium that already burned utility ratepayers won't. Investors are currently pricing in an entire nuclear renaissance that, on the ground, hasn't produced a single working next-generation reactor yet. So after everything you now know, you still want to own a nuclear power plant. Let's say your own project gets everything right, you build on schedule, close to budget, using a proven design. You lock in a 20-year power purchase agreement with a hyperscaler before construction even finishes. Your capacity factor holds above 90% for decades. Your construction debt gets paid down steadily against 6 to 8 decades of predictable, essentially guaranteed revenue. That is one of the most durable businesses in the entire energy sector, a cash machine that quietly outlives the people who financed it. Here's the version that happens more often instead. Regulatory reviews add 3 years nobody budgeted for. Interest keeps compounding through every one of them because it doesn't care whether concrete is currently being poured. Your primary contractor straining under losses on this project, and another one just like it files for bankruptcy in the middle of construction. And the replacement firm needs a full year just to get up to speed on work that's already half finished. Skilled welders and licensed pipe fitters in short supply industry-wide cost more every year you're still looking for them. A single failed concrete test on the containment structure halts an entire section of the site for weeks, while engineers re-verify the surrounding work. By the time you finally generate your first kilowatt hour, the interest alone has added billions nobody accounted for in the original pitch to investors. And the state regulator who has to approve passing those costs on to customers is now facing re-election. You didn't do anything wrong. You just discovered that in this business, the reactor was never the hard part. The reactor has worked reliably for 70 straight years. The decade of financing standing between you and that reactor, that's what actually decides whether you win or lose. Here's the truth. This entire industry is quietly built on the uranium was never the business. The regulatory approval was, the power purchase agreement was, the trust fund you started paying into. Before you had generated a single watt was, a nuclear power plant isn't a machine that turns uranium into electricity. It's a machine that turns decades of financing, patience, and political risk into electricity. And only for whoever survives long enough to collect.